Okay, so you're looking for a deep dive into J. Krishnamurti's Reflexiones sobre el yo.
Yeah.
Specifically those excerpts you sent over about pride and ambition.
Right.
Now, I always thought of those as good things, motivators.
Mm-hmm.
But Krishnamurti seems to think they're a bit more complicated than that.
What's fascinating is how he unravels this seeming contradiction.
Okay.
How can qualities we usually see as positive lead to such negative places within us?
Mm-hmm.
He argues that it all starts with how pride inflates our sense of self-importance.
And of course, that makes us start comparing ourselves to others.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like, oh, I got a higher score on that exam. I must be better.
Krishnamurti uses that very example.
Okay.
Acing an exam, especially if you've outdone everyone else, puffs up the ego.
Yeah.
That feeling of I'm better isn't just a fleeting thing. It reinforces a sense of superiority within the self.
Right.
And that, he argues, is where ambition really takes root.
Because then it's not enough to just be good. You have to be better than... So you're constantly striving, proving your worth, chasing that validation from outside yourself.
That's the cycle he lays bare.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy to see how, taken to an extreme, this constant need for external validation can actually turn pretty dark, leading to what he calls cruel, despiadado, irreflexivo behavior.
Okay, hold on. Cruel. That's a strong word.
Yeah.
How does ambition, even if it's a bit ego-driven, turn into actual cruelty?
He's not just talking about outward aggression here,
Okay.
though he does argue that ambition can pit us against each other, making us callous in our pursuit of being on top.
Right.
But he's also talking about a more insidious cruelty, a kind we inflict on ourselves.
Right.
This constant comparison, this need to prove ourselves, keeps us from appreciating what we have achieved.
So it's like that saying, comparison is the thief of joy.
Mm-hmm.
We're so busy looking over our shoulder that we don't even enjoy the view from where we are.
Precisely. And that's part of what Krishnamurti calls the emptiness of ambition. He describes this feeling of hollowness that can hit even at the peak of success. You reach the top of the mountain, achieve that long-sought goal, and instead of fulfillment, there's nothing.
I've definitely felt that.
Yeah.
Like hitting a big milestone at work. One I'd been working towards for ages and then feeling kind of empty afterward. I thought it would feel different, like I'd finally arrived.
It's a common experience, but one, our achievement-oriented culture doesn't prepare us for Bijano. Krishnamurti argues that this emptiness stems from seeking self-realization through external means.
Okay.
We think that achieving something, being someone, will make us complete. But true realization, he argues, comes from understanding the self, not from accumulating more. And he's not just talking about material possessions, but accomplishments, recognition, even love.
Okay, so if I'm hearing this right, he's saying that this drive for self-realization, which so often fuels ambition, is actually what leads to this emptiness, this feeling of being incomplete.
That's the heart of his argument. He suggests it's like trying to fill a bottomless pit with external validation. No matter how much you pour in, it's never enough.
So where do we go from here?
What?
If this ambition is so ingrained and the rewards it promises are ultimately hollow, how do we escape that cycle?
Yeah.
He's not suggesting we all become hermits.
Right. He acknowledges that we can't simply withdraw from the world or pretend these drives don't exist. And he's not saying all ambition is bad. It's more about understanding how we're conditioned to pursue it and the impact that has on us. For example, he points out how even something as seemingly pure as a child's ambition, say to become an engine driver, is often shaped by external influences rather than a true inner calling.
Okay, so he's saying even those early aspirations are often molded by societal pressures and expectations, not necessarily what truly lights us up.
Exactly. We absorb these messages about what we should want, what will bring us success and validation, often without realizing it. He argues that this conditioning is so pervasive, so ingrained in how we educate and interact with each other, that it's almost inescapable. He uses this powerful phrase: ambition exists not only in the external world, but also in the inner world, in the world of the psyche and of the spirit.
So it's not just about climbing the corporate ladder, but this internal pressure to be more, even in our own self-perception. That's a tough cycle to break.
It is. And this is where he starts to outline what he calls a complete psychological revolution. He's not talking about overthrowing governments, but about a radical shift in our own minds, a way of seeing the world and ourselves that's free from this constant need for validation and comparison.
That sounds intense. A complete revolution. What does that even look like in everyday life? How do we even begin to dismantle that kind of ingrained conditioning?
He suggests it starts with awareness, really seeing how these patterns play out in our own minds. He emphasizes the importance of self-observation, paying attention to our thoughts, feelings, and actions without judgment, just witnessing them.
So it's about noticing when that urge to compare ourselves pops up, when we're driven by the need to be the best, without immediately giving into it or judging ourselves for it.
Exactly. It's about creating space between the stimulus and our reaction, allowing us to see the pattern more clearly. And from that space, from that awareness, we can start to make different choices.
So it's about becoming conscious creators of our own lives, rather than being driven by these unconscious patterns. That's incredibly empowering, but it also feels like a lifelong practice, not a one-time fix.
He would agree. Krishnamurti saw this as an ongoing journey of self-discovery, not a destination. He argues that true freedom comes from understanding the yo, the self, and breaking free from the conditioning that keeps us trapped in this cycle of ambition and dissatisfaction. And this is where he introduces this concept of finding true joy and love in what we do, regardless of the outcome. He argues that real action is free from ambition and self-centered motivation.
It's that idea of the journey is the destination, isn't it? Finding fulfillment in the process itself, not just chasing some distant goal. But that feels so counterintuitive in a world that's obsessed with results, with constantly striving for more.
It does go against the grain, doesn't it? But that's what makes Krishnamurti's work so radical, so challenging, and ultimately so potentially liberating. He's asking us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about success, fulfillment, and what it means to live a truly meaningful life.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem, this cycle of ambition, the emptiness it can create, and how deeply ingrained it is in our society. But where do we even begin to unravel it all? What does this psychological revolution actually look like in practice?
That's where we'll dig in next. Krishnamurti offers some very specific ideas about how to cultivate a mind that's free from the grip of ambition and open to true fulfillment. He starts by highlighting a crucial distinction between ambition and true interest.
All right, let's unpack that. What's the difference?
You see, ambition is always measuring, comparing, striving for something more. True interest, on the other hand, is about the sheer joy of the activity itself, the process rather than the outcome.
So it's like if you love to paint, it's not about becoming the next Picasso. It's about the feeling of the brush in your hand, the colors on the canvas, the pure act of creation.
Exactly. Krishnamurti uses that very example of a painter who delights in painting, not in being better than another painter. There's no need for external validation because the joy comes from within, from that genuine engagement with the process.
That makes me think about those times when I'm so absorbed in something I lose all track of time. Like writing a really good piece. It's not about the byline or the awards. It's that feeling of flow, of being completely present in the work.
That's a perfect example of what Krishnamurti is getting at. He says, if I'm truly interested in painting, if I truly enjoy it, then I don't compete to be the best painter or the most famous. I simply enjoy painting. It's that simple, yet so elusive when our minds are caught in the comparison trap.
Because we're conditioned to think, okay, if I'm good at this, I should be aiming for that. There's always another rung on the ladder.
Yeah.
But if we buy into that, it does make comparison unavoidable.
And Krishnamurti argues that comparison is the death knell for both true interest and inner peace. He points out that we're taught from childhood to compare ourselves. From childhood, we have been taught to compare ourselves with the leader, the best, the most learned, the cleverest, to be the perfect example, to follow the master, to compare, and consequently to compete.
Oh, that resonates. School rankings, employee evaluations, even social media. It's all about where we stack up against everyone else.
And this constant comparison, he argues, breeds ambition in its most toxic form. It creates a perpetual sense of lack of never being good enough. He says, where there's comparison, there must obviously be conflict and contradiction, which implies ambition.
So it's that internal struggle, that feeling of never measuring up, that actually fuels our ambition, but in a way that just perpetuates the cycle.
Precisely. It's like trying to quench your thirst by drinking salt water. It just makes you thirstier. But here's the thing. Krishnamurti also offers a way out of this cycle. He believes that we can reconnect with that pure interest, that joy in the process, by understanding the nature of the self, the yo, and breaking free from the conditioning that keeps us trapped in comparison. He urges us to observe our actions and motivations without judgment. He says, you have to understand how this self is generated, this self that is generated through the feeling of triumph in your various forms. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't act, but understand the feeling that you are acting, that you are achieving something.
So it's about developing self-awareness, right? Noticing when those competitive thoughts arise, when that need for validation kicks in, without getting swept away by it.
He's saying that we don't have to be slaves to those conditioned responses. There's a space between the stimulus and the reaction, and in that space lies the possibility for freedom. He says the perception of this conflict, this feeling of conflict, not what you should do about it, has its own action.
It's like hitting the pause button, right? Instead of immediately reacting to that urge to compare or compete, we create a little breathing room to observe it without judgment. But how do we actually do that? Our minds are so trained to jump into action, to fix things, to strive for something different.
It takes practice for sure. Krishnamurti talks about cultivating a vasiya mind, a mind that's free from the clutter of thoughts, desires, and conditioning. He says, only when it can fully experience that state of solitude, that state of emptiness, that state of non-dependence, can there be action that does not stem from ambition.
So it's about creating a kind of mental stillness, a space of quiet awareness where we can see those patterns without getting caught up in them.
Yes, and from that space of stillness, that vakudar, we can start to make choices that are aligned with our true interests, our genuine passions, rather than being driven by the need for external validation. He reminds us, what is the point of discussing all the rest? How to instill character, what should be done and what shouldn't, and how can we discover it? Surely to discover the source of love, the mind must be extraordinarily free from conflict.
Okay, but let's be real. That's easier said than done, right? We live in a world that's constantly telling us to want more, to be more, to achieve more. How do we even begin to dismantle that kind of deeply ingrained conditioning?
This is where Krishnamurti's idea of a complete psychological revolution comes in. He's not talking about violence or social upheaval. He's talking about a revolution in consciousness, a fundamental shift in the way we see ourselves and the world. He challenged the idea that we need to be ambitious to make progress. He says, what's the use of saying that it's inevitable? What will happen if we are not competitive, not ambitious, not authoritarian? What will happen to me? You'll answer that question later. But can we see that the mind in conflict is the most destructive mind, and that whatever it tries to do, whatever activity it engages in, no matter how reformative, carries within it the seed of destruction?
Wow. So he's saying that this constant striving, this need to be more, is actually a form of violence.
Yeah.
That it's at the root of a lot of the suffering in the world.
Exactly. He believes that true peace, both internal and external, comes from a place of non-striving, from a deep acceptance of what is.
Okay, but how do we square that with the very real need for progress, for positive change in the world? It's like, yes, ambition can be destructive, but it also drives innovation, social justice movements, even artistic breakthroughs.
He wouldn't disagree. Krishnamurti isn't saying all action is inherently bad. It's more about examining the source of that action. Is it coming from a place of wanting to be better than to prove something to fix or control? Or is it arising from a genuine place of love, compassion, and understanding? He uses a powerful analogy to illustrate his point. He says, do I see it as I would see a cobra, that this is the essence of the whole matter? And if I see it, I don't need to do anything about it. It has its own action. Why discuss all the rest? How to instill character, what should be done and what shouldn't, and how can we discover it? Surely to discover the source of love, the mind must be extraordinarily free from conflict. Therefore, can the mind be free from conflict, which means free from competition and all the rest of it?
So it's like instead of trying to suppress or conquer our ambition, we learn to observe it, to understand it without judgment.
Exactly. He compares it to encountering a cobra. We wouldn't try to reason with it, bargain with it, or force it to change, right? We'd simply acknowledge its presence and give it a wide berth. He says, if we can examine the question of initiative, then maybe there is a possibility of understanding self-realization. For most of us, the need to realize ourselves in some form or another becomes urgent. It becomes necessary. In the process of realizing ourselves, many problems arise, many contradictions, many conflicts. In realization, there is perpetual pain. However, we don't know how to escape from it, how to act without realizing ourselves, since in realization itself, there is suffering.
Okay, I'm starting to see the distinction he's making here.
Yeah.
It's not about becoming passive or denying the existence of these drives. It's about changing our relationship to them.
Yes. It's about recognizing that our true power lies not in controlling our experience, but in changing how we relate to it. He talks about this idea of dying to ambition, but not in a literal sense, of course. It's about letting go of that constant need to achieve, to prove ourselves. And he argues that this letting go, this dying, can only happen when we truly understand the nature of the self, the yo, and the illusions it creates. He says, action is not just doing something, isn't it also about thought? For most of us, we're concerned with doing something, and if that action is satisfactory, if it sufficiently guarantees the realization of our own desires, longings, and aspirations, then we readily settle down behind the impulse. But if we don't discover the incentive that underlies the impulse to realize, then fear and frustration are inevitable. So isn't it necessary to find out what this incentive is that drives us? It may be disguised in different colors with different intentions, different meanings, but perhaps if we could cautiously and tentatively explore this question of the incentive, then we would begin to understand an action of thought that doesn't always arise from this awareness of realization.
So it's not about becoming passive or denying the existence of ambition, but about recognizing the illusions it creates and finding a different source of motivation for our actions. A source that's not rooted in that need for self-preservation and validation.
Exactly. It's about shifting from a place of what's in it for me to a place of how can I be of service. Krishnamurti would say it's about aligning our actions with our true nature, which is inherently compassionate, creative, and connected to something much larger than our individual egos.
Okay, that resonates. But how do we even begin to tap into that true nature, that deeper source of motivation, when our minds are so conditioned to operate from this place of ambition and self-seeking? It feels like a monumental task, honestly.
Krishnamurti wouldn't sugarcoat it. It's not easy work. But he also insists that it is possible. And he offers some very specific guidance on how to approach this inner transformation, this psychological revolution. It starts with what he calls recognizing the incentive. He argues that most of our incentives stem from ambition, from pride, from the desire to be safe or to have a good reputation. Now, you may say, or I may say, that my action is the result of a desire to do good or to discover true values or to have an ideology, an incorruptible system, or to do something essentially meritorious, etc. But behind all those words, all those high-sounding phrases, is there not ambition, the impulse, the motive to achieve something in some form? I want to get something. I want to arrive. I want to have comfort, to know mental certainty in which there is no conflict.
So he's saying that even our seemingly selfless acts, our attempts to make the world a better place, can still be tainted by this underlying ambition, this desire for recognition or reward, even if it's subconscious.
Exactly. He's not saying those motivations negate the good that's being done, but he is urging us to look deeper, to question those motives, to see if there's a way to act from a purer place, a place of true selflessness.
That's a tough pill to swallow, honestly. It's like he's saying that even our best intentions can be clouded by ego.
He doesn't shy away from that. He believed that true transformation requires radical honesty, a willingness to see ourselves as we truly are without sugarcoating it.
So how do we cultivate that honesty, that self-awareness, without falling into self-judgment or despair? It feels like a delicate balance.
He suggests it starts with simply observing our minds in action. He says, observe your own minds in operation. You will see the activities and realize that behind them all, no matter how much you may cover them with pleasant words, the impetus is directed towards achievement, towards becoming someone, towards getting a result. In this impulse, there is competitiveness, there is a contemptuous attitude in ambition, there is competitiveness, anxiety for results. And this is the basis of the structure of our society.
It's that constant striving, that need to do something, to be someone, to stand out from the crowd. And it's so ingrained, isn't it? We're practically rewarded for it from the moment we're born.
Precisely. He argues that this conditioning is so deeply embedded in us, it's like the air we breathe. We rarely even question it.
So how do we break free? How do we even begin to dismantle something that's so fundamental to our sense of self, to our place in the world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Krishnamurti doesn't offer easy answers, but he does offer a path, a way of approaching this inner work that's both profound and practical. And it starts with understanding the illusory nature of the self, the yo.
So we're back to this idea of realization again, but now we're seeing it as something that can actually be a hindrance, a trap, even if we're not careful about how we're pursuing it.
It's a subtle point, but crucial to Krishnamurti's thinking. He argues that this drive for self-realization, especially when it's fueled by ambition and the need for external validation, is ultimately a dead end. He says, my incentive is to achieve a result and be sure of that result in the same way that a man who accumulates money also seeks security. He wants security too. So it is that at the base of the motivation that we call ambition lies the desire for security. And to this, we dedicate all our activities, our attitude, all our energy. Can we act without these ambitions, without this impulse for security, without these energies?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. He's connecting ambition to this deep-seated need for security, which makes sense. We achieve, we gain recognition, we build up this sense of self, all in the name of feeling safe, secure in who we are and our place in the world.
And that's precisely the trap, because that kind of security is an illusion. True security, Krishnamurti would argue, doesn't come from external validation, but from understanding the true nature of the self, the yo, which is not bound by those external markers of success or achievement.
Okay, but that's a pretty radical concept. It's like he's asking us to build our house on a foundation of emptiness. That can feel a little unsettling, to say the least.
It's definitely a challenge to the way we're conditioned to think. But he's not saying we should strive for emptiness or try to become empty. It's more about recognizing the emptiness that's already there, the emptiness that's revealed when we let go of all those layers of self-importance and striving.
That reminds me of something he said earlier about how we often experience that feeling of emptiness at the peak of success, the peak of love, even the peak of pride. Like we finally achieved that thing we thought would make us feel whole, and instead there's this sense of, is this all there is?
Exactly. He's saying that emptiness, that vacuidad, is always present, but it's usually obscured by all our striving and clinging. It's only when we stop running, stop grasping, that we can truly face it. And what he found is that this emptiness, far from being a void to be feared, is actually a doorway to a deeper experience of reality. He reminds us, observe your own minds in operation. You will see the activities and realize that behind them all, no matter how much you may cover them with pleasant words, the impetus is directed towards achievement, towards becoming someone, towards getting a result. In this impulse, there is competitiveness. There is a contemptuous attitude and ambition. There is competitiveness, anxiety for results. And this is the basis of the structure of our society. The ambitious man is considered to be a worthy man as someone who is good for society, so that through his ambition, he will create a good atmosphere, etc., etc. We condemn ambition when it is worldly. We don't condemn it when we call it spiritual. A man who has renounced the world, and seeks something beyond, is he not also motivated by the ambition to be something?
So to be clear, he's not saying we shouldn't have aspirations, that we should just give up and accept the status quo. He's talking about a different quality of action, one that's not fueled by that need for self-preservation and aggrandizement.
Exactly. He uses this powerful phrase, can we act without these ambitions, without this impulse for security, without these energies? That's the heart of what he's proposing, a way of being in the world that's not driven by fear, lack, or the need to prove ourselves.
But how do we even begin to tap into that way of being? It feels like swimming against the current of our entire culture, which is so deeply invested in ambition and achievement.
He doesn't pretend it's easy. He calls it a complete psychological revolution. And he emphasizes that it's not about forcing ourselves to be different, but about understanding the ways in which we're already imprisoned by these patterns. He sees that each one of us seeks realization through ideas, through capability, through artistic expression, through writing a book, a poem, through love, through being generous, through trying to get people to have a good opinion of us. Consequently, are not all our activities the result of this urge for self-realization? And behind that urge is ambition. When I see that and realize it, when I become aware of it, then I realize that wherever there is self-realization, there has to be suffering.
So how do we step out of that current, so to speak? How do we disentangle ourselves from something that feels so deeply ingrained, so fundamental to who we think we are?
Krishnamurti would say it starts with recognizing the incentive, the underlying motivation that's driving us. He's not suggesting we analyze our way out of it, but rather that we simply observe with a sense of curiosity how this drive for self-realization is playing out in our own lives. He says, this impulse towards realizing ourselves is one of our problems, isn't it? This demand to realize ourselves exists in both small and large matters. To be someone in one's own home, to dominate one's wife and children, and to be subject to oneself in the office with the aim of being promoted, with the aim of one day being someone. So that is the process of my life. It is the process of all our lives. So how does a mind like that become free from this longing for self-realization? How am I going to free myself from that desire?
So it's about awareness, but also about honesty, right?
Yeah.
Being willing to see those patterns without judgment even, or maybe especially when they show up in the areas of our lives where we think we're being good or successful, like that need to dominate, to be right, to control the narrative. That's ambition too, just in a different disguise.
Yeah, precisely. And often it's those subtle, insidious forms of ambition that are hardest to recognize and release. But here's the really interesting part. Krishnamurti argues that simply becoming aware of these patterns, simply seeing them clearly without trying to fix them or change them, can be transformative in and of itself.
That sounds almost too simple. Like if we just shine a light on these unconscious patterns, they'll magically disappear.
It's not exactly magic, but he does suggest that awareness has its own power. He compares it to seeing a danger like a cobra in our path. We don't have to do anything. The seeing itself creates the necessary shift in our behavior. He reminds us, so our consciousness is this continual aspiring and expiring, being important and not being important, accepting and rejecting. This is the daily life of our consciousness. And behind this, the mind is seeking an outlet. If I can understand that, if I can grasp its full meaning, then perhaps it will be possible to have an action that is not related to ambition, that doesn't belong to the me, that is not self-realization.
So it's not that the ambition itself disappears, but that our relationship to it changes. We see it for what it is, this conditioned response.
Yeah.
And that seeing creates a space for something else to emerge.
Exactly. And what emerges in that space, he argues, is true freedom. Not freedom from something, but freedom to be fully present, fully alive, fully responsive to what life is asking of us in each moment.
It's a radical idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
To find freedom not by achieving something or becoming someone, but by letting go of that very need, that constant striving.
It is radical and incredibly challenging, especially in a culture that values ambition and achievement above almost all else. But according to Krishnamurti, it's the only path to true fulfillment, both individually and collectively. He believed that a world free from the tyranny of ambition is not a utopia, but a possibility that begins within each one of us. He leaves us with this. Therefore, the question is, how can one live in this world without producing external and internal conflict? Because internal conflict determines external conflict. Only a mind that is truly free from conflict at every level, because it has no psychological problem of any kind. Only such a mind can discover if there is something beyond itself. Basically, our problem is not how to earn more money, how to make a hydrogen bomb, or whether or not we should join the common market. Such problems are not very profound. They will be determined and controlled by economic factors, by historical events, and by the countless pressures of sovereign governments, societies, and religions. What matters is being able to abstract from all that, not by retreating, not by becoming a monk or a nun, but by really understanding the whole meaning of it all. One has to discover for oneself whether there is even the slightest possibility of being completely free from the psychological structure of society, which is to be free from ambition.
This has been an incredible deep dive, and I think you've given us a lot to think about. This idea of finding freedom from ambition, not by suppressing it, but by understanding it, by seeing through its illusions. It's a real game changer. I have a feeling I'll be revisiting these ideas for a long time to come.
As will I. Krishnamurti's work has a way of staying with you, of prompting these ongoing reflections long after you've put the book down. And ultimately, isn't that the mark of truly transformative work?
It certainly is. Well, on that note, we'll leave you with this question to ponder. What would it look like to live a life free from the grip of ambition, a life driven by true interest, by love, by a deep connection to something larger than ourselves?
It's a question worth asking, and perhaps even more